It was in Vienna on a night heavy with silence that Alma Mahler, widow of a genius, stood by the tall window of her home. The air carried the faint rhythm of hooves striking cobblestones, a sound both distant and eternal. Inside, she gazed out at the fading city lights, her life behind her like a score unfinished, each note filled with longing and betrayal. To many, she was Muse, to some destroyer, to others still only a woman searching for her own reflection among the voices of men who desired her. It was here, in that fragile pause between the centuries, that her legend was already beginning to form. Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet remembrance. Before we step into the shadows of Alma Mahler's story, I invite you to leave a trace of yourself as well. Tell me in the comments when and where you are listening, so that across time and across continents, your memory may join others. If you wish, press the button that allows this channel to grow, so together we may wander through the corridors of timeless history. The story begins not with fame, not with scandal, but with a child among canvases. Vienna in the late 19th century was a city poised like a jewel in a golden setting. The old empire glittered with its operas, its balls, its carriages sweeping along wide avenues, yet beneath it stirred questions, new philosophies, and unrest. In one modest yet cultured home lived young Alma Schindler, born in 1879, daughter of the painter Emil Jakob Schindler and his wife Anna. To the little girl, the walls were alive with images, seascapes, meadows, skies stretched with the light of her father's hand. The air smelled often of oil and turpentine, and the soft scratch of a brush upon canvas was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The Schindler household was not one of great wealth, but it was a world of art, of conversations where painters and musicians crossed the threshold. Alma, with her watchful eyes, absorbed not only color and form but also the music drifting through the salons of Vienna. From the earliest years, she seemed drawn to both sight and sound, as if she could not choose which realm belonged to her. She learned the piano, and the notes fell from her fingers like drops of water from a fountain. Yet her mind, even then, was restless. Her father was gentle, filled with melancholy that hung about him like a mist. Alma adored him, and his death when she was just a child left an emptiness that would shape her forever. In place of his quiet constancy, she discovered within herself a desire to capture attention, to be seen, to not be lost in the shadow of others. Is this not often how grief remakes us, not into sorrowful statues, but into restless wanderers, searching for what was once steady? Her mother, Anna, beautiful and strong, remarried the painter Karl Mahl, who became not only stepfather, but also a central figure in Vienna's art scene. With Mahl came a new circle of visitors, artists of the secession, dreamers of a new art that would break away from the old academies. Gustav Klimt, with his golden visions, was among them. Alma grew in this atmosphere, and soon she was more than a child at the edge of a room. She was a presence. Her beauty was remarked upon early, tall with luminous eyes and a proud carriage. Yet even in youth she carried that dual inheritance, the painter's melancholy and the widow's determination. Alma's diaries from her adolescence, later published, reveal a young girl already torn between the desire to create and the desire to be adored. She practiced the piano diligently, studied harmony and counterpoint, and dreamed of becoming a composer. She also wrote of love, of longing glances, of the thrill of being desired. For Alma, the two were intertwined, creation and seduction, art and intimacy. She believed she was destined for more than a quiet life. Perhaps she had no choice, raised in those salons where art was worshipped as religion. It is tempting, looking back, to judge these early stirrings as vanity. Yet who among us does not hunger, especially when young, to be recognized, to have our gifts not overlooked? Alma's gifts were real, Her songs, written in her teens, bear witness to a sensitive ear for melody, to a talent that might have flowered further if nurtured without obstruction. But Vienna was not ready for a woman who would take her place beside the great composers. The role of muse was permitted, the role of creator far less so. Imagine Alma at the piano in her stepfather's house, the late afternoon light slanting through lace curtains, the air carrying the scent of roses from the garden. She leans forward as her hands strike the keys, her voice humming melodies she has fashioned herself. Around her, perhaps, men twice her age discuss philosophy or politics or brushstrokes. She listens, but she also longs to speak in her own language, through music. Did she already sense that her compositions, no matter how refined, would always be met with indulgent smiles rather than reverence? Was this knowledge what drew her later toward men whose fame could never be doubted? For in Alma's world, identity was often reflected in the gaze of others. She had inherited beauty, intelligence, and charm, and soon she learned that these were a kind of currency. Yet beneath it all was a quiet current of sadness, that of the little girl who had lost her father and sought, ever after, a figure to both protect and admire her. In this mixture of desire and loss, of talent and restraint, the pattern of her future was set. Vienna itself shaped her. This city of contrasts, where waltzes floated from dance halls, even as new dissonances disturbed the concert halls, where Sigmund Freud was beginning to uncover hidden desires, and where Gustav Klimt's paintings shimmered with sensuality. Alma was a child of this turning point, both bound by tradition and compelled by modernity. Her early years, then, were less a prelude than a seedbed, rich with contradictions. It is in such contradictions that her legend would root itself. Alma the child among canvases, Alma the girl at the piano, Alma the adolescent writing of love in her diary. All of these lived within the woman who would later capture, and sometimes devastate, the lives of men celebrated as geniuses. Yet at this beginning, she was still only Alma Schindler, walking the garden paths, listening to the quiet hum of the city around her, carrying within her the promise of both music and memory. The brushstroke left unfinished on her father's canvas seemed to linger in the air. It was as though his hand had paused, and she, his daughter, had inherited not the completed picture, but the task of carrying forward its longing. And so, Alma's first chapter closes not with triumph nor with scandal, but with the quiet sound of a brush pulled gently away from canvas, the painting incomplete, the silence awaiting its next note. The brushstroke left unfinished on her father's canvas seemed to tremble in the dim light of memory, and from that faint suspended gesture, we follow Alma into the next chamber of her youth. The canvas that remained incomplete became, in a way, a mirror for the young girl's own unfolding, a beginning marked not by certainty but by possibility, strokes of intention waiting to be filled. It was in those years that Alma began to discover her own gift, not in pigments upon cloth, but in the world of sound, in the fragile but insistent voice of music that rose each time her fingers touched the keys of the piano. The house in Vienna where she grew, under the care of her mother Anna and the firm guidance of her stepfather Karl Mahl, was alive with artistic company. Painters gathered to debate color and form, writers argued late into the night about meaning and modernity, and in corners of the salon, music would drift. Sonatas played softly as if to steady the shifting tide of ideas. Alma, still a young woman but no longer a child, would slip into these evenings with a quiet composure, listening with eyes that rarely missed a detail. In her presence, the air seemed to hold a delicate tension, for she was already becoming known not merely as Emil Schindler's daughter, but as someone with beauty that unsettled and intrigued. Yet what stirred more deeply within her was the question of her own artistry. Her lessons at the piano were rigorous. She studied harmony, counterpoint, and form with teachers who understood that talent alone was never enough, that music demanded discipline. The young Alma practiced with diligence, hours spent in solitude with only the echo of her own notes for company. It was in those solitary moments, more than in the brilliance of salons, that her identity began to shape itself. She composed songs, lieder in the tradition of Schubert and Schumann, her melodies tender, her harmonies often tinged with the melancholy she had carried since childhood. In the pages of her notebooks, words and music entwined, a secret testimony to her need not only to be admired but to create. Her diary, that faithful confidant, reveals a mind in constant dialogue with itself. There are passages filled with self-reproach, where she doubts her capacity, where she wonders whether women are destined to serve as inspiration, rather than as creators in their own right. Yet in other moments, her pen runs fast with certainty. She feels chosen, exceptional, touched by the same flame that animates the geniuses she encounters. This oscillation between humility and ambition is perhaps what gave her life its particular rhythm, one that would echo through every relationship she entered. Vienna, around her, was shifting. The fin de siècle carried with it both decadence and anxiety. Freud had begun to analyze the subconscious. Klimt was painting women wrapped in gold and mystery, and young artists were breaking away from tradition with new visions. Alma was formed by this ferment, and in some ways she embodied its contradictions, longing for security, yet drawn to danger, seeking approval, yet scorning convention, desiring both to create and to surrender. Her songs from this period reflect these tensions, some tender as lullabies, others restless with unexpected turns of harmony. Few were ever published in her youth, but those who heard them remarked upon their sensitivity. Imagine her at 17, seated at the piano in a quiet room, the twilight fading beyond the curtains. Her fingers move over the keys, her lips shaping the words of a song she has written, perhaps inspired by a line of poetry. The melody rises fragile but insistent, as though it seeks to assert itself against the silence that presses in from the world beyond. In that moment, she is not a muse, nor a beauty to be admired. She is a creator, alone with the truth of her own voice. But how long could such moments survive in a society that viewed her talent as secondary to her appearance? Visitors to the Mahl household often remarked upon her charm, her intelligence, her quick wit. Men older than her would lean closer in conversation, fascinated by her sharpness and the way she seemed to carry herself with both innocence and assurance. Yet behind her poised demeanor, Alma felt the burden of choice. To compose seriously would mean a life of struggle, a life perhaps without security. To enter society as a great beauty, admired and pursued, promised influence, comfort, and a place among the celebrated. Was it vanity or simply realism that made her waver between these paths? Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was the eternal conflict between what the soul longs to express and what the world is prepared to receive. Her relationship with her stepfather, Karl Mahl, was complex. He supported her education, yet his own convictions about art and society shaped her perception of herself. Mahl believed in circles of influence, in the power of salons to shape culture. Alma, nurtured in that atmosphere, came to understand that presence itself could be an art, that the ability to enchant, to provoke, to inspire, was a form of creation. And so, from these years, two parallel identities emerged. Alma, the composer, alone with her notes and words, and Alma, the muse in waiting, aware that her beauty gave her a different kind of power. In her diary, she once asked, almost plaintively, whether it was possible to be both. Could a woman be artist and muse, creator and creation? The question hung in her writing, unresolved, like a chord that refuses to resolve into harmony. That question would follow her throughout her life, shaping her choices and haunting her regrets. The late afternoons in Vienna often brought with them a stillness after the bustle of the day. Alma would walk the garden paths, the smell of damp earth rising, the sound of distant bells marking the hour. She would pause, listening, always listening, as though the city itself might whisper to her a melody. In those hours, she dreamed of a future not yet defined, a life that could stretch toward greatness, though she could not yet see whether it would come through her own hand or through the hands of those she would love. As she grew into young womanhood, the circle of admirers around her widened. Some saw only her beauty. Others glimpsed the sharpness of her mind, the way her eyes seemed to pierce beyond polite conversation. In these early encounters, Alma learned the intoxicating effect she could have, but she also learned the loneliness it carried. To be admired is not always to be understood, and so her songs became confidences, whispers set to music, fragments of her soul preserved against the incompleteness of outward admiration. The candle that burned beside her piano late into the night often guttered as her fingers lingered over a phrase, trying to decide where the melody should turn. It is tempting to imagine her pausing, gazing into the flame, wondering whether she herself would bend toward creation or toward surrender. The room grew dark, the music paused, and the candlelight flickered against the polished wood. It was in that small circle of light that Alma wrestled with her destiny, though perhaps she did not yet know it. And so, the second part of her story rests on the image of that candle, trembling beside the piano, illuminating both the promise of her talent and the uncertainty of her path. Its flame leaned as if in hesitation, a wavering reminder that brilliance may burn, but it is easily extinguished. The candle by the piano flickered, its flame bowing and straightening as though caught between breath and silence. And it is in that flickering light that we see Alma at a turning point. For soon her path would lead her away from the solitude of her own compositions and into the orbit of a man whose genius demanded not only admiration, but sacrifice. The flame bent, and so too did Alma, drawn toward the brilliance of Gustav Mahler. It was in Vienna that their lives first crossed, though to Alma it must have felt less like an introduction and more like the sudden arrival of destiny. Mahler was already a figure of awe, conductor of the imperial opera, revered, feared, endlessly disciplined. His presence carried with it the weight of authority, as though the very air stiffened when he entered a room. Alma, young and radiant, encountered him in the midst of her own stirrings as a composer. And what transpired between them was not merely attraction, but collision. Their courtship was swift, almost startling in its intensity. Mahler, nearly 20 years older, saw in Alma both beauty and devotion, a woman who might serve as his anchor while he carried the weight of his monumental symphonies. Alma, in turn, felt the pull of his authority, the promise that in giving herself to him, she might partake of immortality. Yet beneath this promise there was already a shadow, for Mahler demanded not only her love, but her silence. In a letter that has since become infamous, he set forth his terms. There could not be two composers in one household. Alma must renounce her own music, must devote herself entirely to his work, must be wife, confidant, caretaker, but never rival. For some, this seems an act of cruelty. For others, merely the logic of a man consumed by his art. For Alma, it was both wound and temptation. Could she not, she wondered, live her creative life through him? Could she not shape his world, if not her own? It is here that we encounter one of the central paradoxes of Alma's story. Her willingness to bend, to give up what was hers, not from weakness but from a desire to be indispensable to greatness. She placed her own songs aside, not destroyed, but hidden like pressed flowers in a book. To some she would later confess regret, to others she would claim pride in her sacrifice. The truth lies perhaps in both directions, like the candle flame that wavered but did not go out. Their marriage bound her to Mahler's life of relentless creation. The household revolved around his compositions, his rehearsals, his silences. Alma managed the practicalities, soothed his anxieties, arranged his travels, shielded him from intrusion. Yet within her, the music she had written did not vanish. It lay dormant, a current beneath the surface. And in her diary, she sometimes allowed her bitterness to emerge, the sense that she had been asked to give up her voice so that his might resound more fully. Still, Alma was not merely a passive companion. Her presence in Mahler's life shaped him in ways both subtle and profound. Her insight into his work, her ability to critique, her intuition for emotional nuance, all of these found their way into his music. He dedicated his Eighth Symphony to her, and in the Rückert Lieder, one hears echoes of her spirit. Was she merely muse, or was she collaborator, unacknowledged, yet essential? The question hovers unanswered, as so many questions in her life would. Vienna in those years saw Mahler at the height of his powers, and Alma was by his side at rehearsals, at premieres, at the grand dinners where critics and patrons gathered. She watched as audiences applauded, as musicians bent themselves to his strict gestures. Yet when the applause faded, she often felt the loneliness of one whose role was to support, never to shine. She was surrounded by music, but the music was not hers. Imagine her in their home, the heavy curtains drawn against the winter chill, Mahler at his desk, scribbling notes furiously onto staves. Alma sits nearby, perhaps embroidering, perhaps reading, her thoughts circling around the songs she once composed. She hums a melody under her breath, softly enough not to disturb him. For a moment she feels it rising, the urge to set it down, but then she catches herself, falls silent, and the moment passes. Such was the rhythm of her life, an alternation of surrender and silent resistance. It is easy for us, looking back, to condemn Mahler's demand as oppressive, to pity Alma for her sacrifice. Yet to Alma herself, the choice was less clear. She loved him with a devotion that astonished even her, and she believed that in serving his genius, she was fulfilling her own destiny. Was this delusion, or was it a different form of creation? Building, not symphonies, but a life that enabled them? Perhaps both truths dwell side by side, inseparable. Their early married years were not without tenderness. Mahler, for all his severity, could be affectionate, even dependent. Alma often found herself guiding his moods, comforting his insecurities, reminding him of his worth. She was both wife and mirror, reflecting back to him the greatness he sought to affirm. But slowly, beneath the surface, cracks began to form. For what happens when the self that has been suppressed begins to stir again? Her beauty, her vitality, her quickness of spirit did not go unnoticed by others. Admirers gathered around her even as she fulfilled her duties to Mahler. She smiled, she conversed. She allowed herself to be admired, though she always returned to her husband's side. Yet within, the candle flickered again, whispering that a life devoted wholly to another might one day consume her. The silence after a piano chord often lingers longer than the sound itself. So too did the silence of Alma's sacrifice. She gave up her own compositions, but the absence they left resonated more deeply than she perhaps expected. It was in that silence that her identity began to ache, that her longing for recognition, for her own voice would one day find expression in choices that astonished and scandalized. For now, though, the image remains of Alma and Gustav in their Viennese household bound together in brilliance and restraint. He writes, she waits. He conducts, she attends. He creates, she enables. The music soars, but in its soaring we hear also the quiet echo of a song unwritten, a melody paused just before it could unfold. And so this part of her life closes with that silence, the silence after a chord, filled with beauty and with ache, a silence that foreshadows the storm yet to come. The silence after the chord lingered, stretched thin across the hours of Alma's married life, and it is into this silence that we step, into the rooms where her days were woven with the routine of devotion and restraint. The echo of her own music had been set aside, and in its place grew the rhythm of another's genius. For to live as the wife of Gustav Mahler was to inhabit a world that revolved not around her own pulse, but around his ceaseless demands, his endless rehearsals, his solitary need for creation. Their home in Vienna was ordered with precision. Gustav, methodical even in his private life, required silence for his work, long hours where no interruption could be permitted. Alma learned to navigate the stillness of those times, to anticipate his moods, to provide what he required before the need could be spoken. She arranged his manuscripts, oversaw his correspondence, prepared for his journeys to the countryside where he composed most freely. In her care he found steadiness. In her admiration, he found confirmation, and yet in the quiet corners of those tasks lay the ache of her own unfinished music, the diary entries where she recorded not only her devotion, but her dissatisfaction. The routine of their summers became almost ritual. They would retreat to lakeside houses in the Salzkammergut or to the Dolomites, where Gustav demanded absolute seclusion to compose. A small composing hut would be built, isolated, where he worked from early morning until night, walking, pacing, scribbling furiously at his scores. Alma remained in the larger house, walking by the lake, tending to the household, sometimes joining him for meals. To the outside world it seemed idyllic, the great composer in the natural solitude he required. Yet for Alma, these summers carried a loneliness that could not be spoken. The lake reflected not only the mountains above, but also her own isolation, the vast surface beneath which her silenced creativity lay. She was a woman of vitality, drawn to society, to conversation, to the movement of salons, and yet her married life often demanded withdrawal, patience, and self-effacement. In her diary, she admitted that she felt herself fading, that her own desires had been placed on a shelf like books left unopened. Still, she endured, not with resignation, but with a mixture of pride and bitterness. Pride because she believed she was serving greatness. Bitterness because greatness asked more than it gave. In the evenings, when Gustav returned from his hut weary yet exhilarated, Alma received him with admiration. She read his music, commented with insight, offered encouragement. He valued her responses, though often in the manner of one who expects understanding rather than one who recognizes equality. In those hours, she became both audience and confidant, her own mind subsumed into his. One wonders, did she ever imagine, even fleetingly, what it might have been like if their positions had been reversed, if she were the one returning from long hours of work, if he were the one waiting with patience and praise? Perhaps such imaginings flickered briefly before being extinguished, like the flame of a candle snuffed before it could burn too long. The city beyond their home continued its restless rhythm. Vienna at the turn of the century was alive with movements, artistic, political, philosophical. Alma occasionally rejoined these circles, attending gatherings, conversing with those who admired her wit as much as her beauty. Men were drawn to her not only for her appearance, but for the quickness of her thoughts, the sharpness of her questions. In those encounters, she tasted again the possibility of being more than a shadow beside her husband. Yet always she returned to Gustav, bound by marriage, bound by love, bound by the promise she had made to set aside her own music for his. Daily life with Mahler was not without tenderness. He could be affectionate, dependent, vulnerable in ways that surprised those who knew only his public severity. Alma cherished these moments, for they reminded her that even geniuses carry fragility, that even the strongest require comfort. She was, in truth, indispensable to him, yet to be indispensable is not always to be fulfilled. There were nights when she lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, and wondered if the devotion she offered would one day turn to resentment. The strain of self-denial left marks, subtle but accumulating. She became restless, irritable at times, sharp in her comments, then remorseful. She oscillated between the joy of being at the center of genius and the despair of being excluded from her own. This duality shaped her days, each one a pendulum swing between light and shadow. Her diaries from these years reveal a growing sense of conflict. She wrote of her admiration for Mahler, of her pride in his accomplishments, but also of her longing for attention, for affection that was not always forthcoming. She craved not only love but recognition, not only devotion but freedom. The contradiction wore on her, as contradictions always do when stretched over years. Imagine her again in their Viennese apartment, the heavy drapes drawn against the chill. Gustav bent over his desk with ink-stained fingers, Alma seated at her own writing table. She lifts a pen, begins to write in her diary, confesses to the page the feelings she cannot speak aloud. She writes of loneliness, of yearning, of the music within her that still stirs. Outside, the snow falls quietly, muffling the sounds of the city. Inside, the silence deepens, each of them occupied by work that reveals the gulf between them. What does it mean to be married to a genius? To some it seems privilege, to others burden. For Alma, it was both. She carried the weight of his needs, but she also shared in his triumphs. She watched audiences rise to their feet, critics bow in admiration, orchestras thunder under his command. And in those moments she felt herself part of something larger, as though her sacrifice had meaning. But once the applause faded, once the evening ended, the emptiness returned. It is easy to imagine that had she lived in another era, Alma's songs might have found their own audience, her compositions their own stage. But in her time, in her marriage, her music became silence, her silence became service, and her service became the structure of her days. And so this chapter of her life rests in the sound of a door closing, the door of her composing room, shut gently but firmly, a door behind which her own voice remained unheard. Outside that door, the world of Gustav Mahler unfolded, magnificent and consuming. Inside, the quiet grew heavier, a silence that pressed upon her heart like the weight of unspoken words. The door closed, but it was not locked, and one day, Alma would open it again. The door had closed, gently yet firmly, upon the sound of Alma's own music, and it seemed as though behind that barrier her voice was consigned to silence. Yet life, with its unforeseen turns, would soon open another door, one not into creation, but into loss. For in the rhythm of her days with Gustav Mahler, a new presence had briefly brightened the household, a presence small and fragile, who brought with her both laughter and promise. Their daughter, little Maria Anna, known as Putzi, was born in 1902, and her arrival filled the rooms with a warmth that even the strictest routines of Gustav's work could not suppress. Alma, so long accustomed to serving as caretaker of a husband's genius, now found herself immersed in the tenderness of motherhood. The sound of a child's laughter is unlike any other. It pierces through silence, through solemnity, through grief. In the Mahler household, where the walls had so often resounded only with the echo of music or the weight of discipline, the voice of Putzi rang out like a bright bird in early morning. Alma adored her, and even Gustav, stern and absorbed though he was, softened at the sight of the little girl toddling toward him, arms outstretched. For a time, the closed door of Alma's own creativity seemed less heavy, for she had found another way to give, another role in which to pour her passion. But happiness, like a candle flame, is vulnerable to the faintest breath. In 1907, diphtheria entered their home. The illness struck Puzzi with a swiftness that Alma could hardly comprehend. The child weakened, her laughter fading into fevered cries, her bright eyes dimming with exhaustion. Alma and Gustav hovered helplessly, watching the cruel hand of disease tighten its grip. There are moments in life when even the greatest power, the greatest talent stands useless, and for Mahler, who could command orchestras with a gesture, the helplessness was unbearable. For Alma, who had already known the loss of her father, the impending shadow was a familiar, dreadful return. Puzzi died in July of that year, and the house that had echoed with her laughter fell into a silence far heavier than any that had existed before. Alma's grief was profound, an ache that no duty could soothe. She wrote in her diary of the emptiness, the unbearable stillness of a small chair left vacant. The rhythm of her marriage, already strained by her sacrifices, cracked further under the weight of shared mourning. For grief does not always unite. Sometimes it isolates, pressing each soul into its private chamber of sorrow. Mahler, faced with this devastation, buried himself deeper in work, as though music might shield him from the void. Alma, left to wander through rooms once filled with her daughter's presence, felt the isolation deepen. The closed door of her music was now joined by another, the door of motherhood, slammed shut by fate, and she began to ask herself questions that disturbed even her own heart. Was her life always to be one of giving, only to have what she gave taken from her? Was she to remain forever in the shadow of others, her own light extinguished before it could shine? The silence of grief is different from the silence of sacrifice. It carries with it the weight of absence, the echo of what once was. Alma lived within that silence in the months that followed, each corner of the house a reminder, each sound a ghost. The laughter that had once been a bird of morning became a haunting in her memory. She clutched at photographs, at small garments, as though they might keep her daughter close. Yet nothing filled the void. It was in this rawness of loss that Alma's restlessness grew sharper. She longed for comfort, for recognition, for something that would ease the ache. Her devotion to Gustav had been tested before, but now, in her grief, she felt her needs rising with an urgency she could not repress. The unspoken conflicts of their marriage, her silence music, her desire for affection, her hunger for acknowledgement, were magnified by the emptiness Puzzi's death had left. Gustav, too, was wounded, though his wounds took the form of retreat rather than expression. He sought escape in travel, in new posts, in the distractions of work. Alma, left behind in spirit if not in body, began to drift. It was perhaps inevitable that another's presence would catch her attention, another's words of admiration and affection would touch the part of her that had grown hollow. But that moment lay just ahead. For now, the house still trembled with sorrow, and Alma's footsteps echoed through rooms where the small voice of her child would never again be heard. Imagine her standing before the window, the curtains heavy around her, watching the street below. The world continues. Carriages roll past, children's laughter rings faintly from somewhere beyond, but inside she is still unmoving. On a table behind her lies a small doll once held by Puzzi. The fabric is worn, the hair matted, yet Alma cannot bear to set it aside. She touches it lightly, as though the object might still carry the warmth of her daughter's hands. In such moments, grief becomes not only memory but ritual, a ritual of holding on when letting go is impossible. What does one do with the silence of loss? Some fill it with faith, others with work, still others with new love. Alma lingered at the threshold of each, uncertain, restless. her heart torn between devotion to the memory of her child and the unyielding need to live. This tension would define her in the years to come, pushing her toward choices that both scandalized and liberated, both wounded and revealed. The image of the empty chair remains, a small object in a room now too large. It lingers as the emblem of this part of Alma's story, a reminder that even in the grandest households, among the most celebrated names, tragedy comes with the same cruelty it does to the humble. The chair remains, empty, silent, waiting, as though holding space for the laughter that once filled it. And it is from this image, the empty chair in the silence of a grieving house, that the next chapter begins, for into this void would step a presence, both comforting and dangerous, a man who would awaken Alma's desire once more, even as it pulled her further from the man she had promised to serve. The empty chair remained in its place, a silent witness to absence, and from that image of stillness, the story turns to a presence that disrupted the silence, not with laughter of a child, but with the insistent murmur of desire. Into the hollowed space of Alma's grief stepped Walter Gropius, a man younger than Mahler, an architect whose vision sought to reimagine not only buildings, but the very fabric of modern life. If the vacant chair spoke of what had been lost, the echo of Gropius's voice began to speak of what might yet be found, though in a form far from peace. It was in the summer retreat during one of Gustav's long absences that Alma first encountered him. Gropius was handsome, earnest, filled with the energy of youth. His eyes held both admiration and promise when he turned them upon her, and Alma, who had long been accustomed to admiration, felt something different in his gaze. It was not the indulgent approval of society, nor the severe authority of Gustav, but rather the reverence of a man who saw her as both woman and ideal. At a time when her heart ached from loss, when her sense of self was thin and wavering, such recognition struck deep. Their conversations began innocently enough, words exchanged in the cool shade of the veranda, or during walks along the lake. He spoke of architecture, of lines and spaces, of the way structures might open themselves to light. She listened, intrigued not so much by his theories as by the fervor with which he spoke them. For in that fervor, she heard an echo of the passion she had once felt in her own music, a passion she had been asked to silence. It is no wonder that her heart, hungry for acknowledgement, leaned toward the sound of it. Soon words gave way to glances, and glances to touches. Alma's diary of this time records her confusion, her exhilaration, her guilt. She loved Gustav, or at least she believed she did, but she also longed for life, for vitality, for a sense of being desired not merely as a supporter, but as a being of her own. Gropius offered this, and she accepted, though not without inner turmoil. In the secrecy of their meetings, Alma tasted once more the sweetness of being central, of being chosen, of being seen. The affair carried with it both intensity and danger. Alma was not a woman who hid easily. Her beauty and her presence made concealment difficult. Yet she and Gropius wove their encounters into the folds of daily life, crafting moments of intimacy where they could. The contrast was stark. The precision and silence of Gustav's world on one side, the breathless urgency of Gropius's devotion on the other. Alma moved between them, torn, restless, unable to reconcile the two. What does it mean to betray? Is betrayal the act itself, or the moment of longing that precedes it, or the silence afterward when nothing is confessed? Alma wrestled with these questions, though her heart often answered before her mind could weigh them. She felt alive with Gropius, and in feeling alive, she found herself unwilling to relinquish him, even when duty whispered otherwise. For Gustav, the truth emerged in a letter, mistakenly sent. Gropius, in a moment of carelessness, addressed an ardent note to Alma, but posted it to her husband. Mahler, upon reading the words, felt not only shock, but devastation. He confronted Alma, and in that confrontation, the fragile order of their marriage shattered. Alma, who had long suppressed her grievances, now spoke them openly. She confessed her unhappiness, her loneliness, her sense of suffocation. She told him of her silenced music, of her hunger for love that was more than service. For Gustav, accustomed to command, these revelations were crushing. Yet the confrontation also awakened something unexpected in him. Realizing the depth of Alma's despair, he sought to change. He turned to Sigmund Freud, seeking guidance, exploring his own psyche in the hope of salvaging their bond. He begged Alma to remain with him, to give him another chance, to believe that he could love her not only as caretaker, but as equal. Whether Alma believed him, whether she forgave him, remains unclear. What is certain is that the affair with Gropius marked a fracture from which their marriage never fully recovered. Still, Alma did not abandon Gustav. She remained by his side, even as her heart was torn. The pull of loyalty, the weight of shared history, the recognition of his genius, all these bound her to him. Yet the presence of Gropius lingered, a reminder that she was not wholly his, that part of her sought another path. In the shadow of this triangle, Alma's life grew more complicated, more charged with ambiguity. Imagine her once more walking the lakeside paths, the air cool and fragrant with pine. On one side, in his hut, Gustav labors over a symphony, each note pressed with the force of his spirit. On the other, perhaps waiting at the edge of the woods, Gropius longs for a glance, a moment, a word. Alma stands between them, her heart pulled in both directions, her steps uncertain. In her diary, she writes of love and despair, of guilt and yearning, of the impossibility of choosing without losing. The echoes of her daughter's laughter, still haunting her memory, mingled with the intensity of these new desires. Perhaps grief had made her reckless. Perhaps longing had made her bold. Whatever the cause, Alma stepped fully into this affair, and in doing so, she stepped further into the role that history would remember her for. The woman who inspired, who unsettled, who could not be contained within a single life or a single love. The sound that lingers at the end of this chapter is not music nor laughter, but footsteps echoing in a corridor. Footsteps that belong to no one and to all three. Alma moving between husband and lover. Husband pacing in despair, lover waiting in hope. Footsteps without resolution, fading into silence, leaving the question of where they might lead. The footsteps in the corridor echoed, fading into silence. And it is in that silence we find Gustav Mahler weakened, his stride unsteady, his breath shorter than before. The years of tireless conducting, of ceaseless composing, of inner storms carried in silence had taken their toll upon his body. Heart disease shadowed him, the physician's words heavy and final, and Alma, caught between loyalty and longing, became once more the caretaker, though her heart still wandered. The air around them thickened with the smell of medicines, sharp tinctures and powders that mingled with the faint scent of ink on manuscript pages. Mahler's health began its decline not long after the discovery of Alma's affair, as though his grief and shock had weakened a constitution already fragile. In 1907, the year of their daughter Putzi's death, he was also forced to resign from the Vienna court opera, beset by critics and exhausted by years of conflict with performers and officials. Loss upon loss gathered around him: child, position, health. Alma, though embittered, remained at his side, her role shifting once more into that of nurse and companion. She prepared the medicines, ensured quiet when he needed rest, and yet inside she felt the pull of freedom, the ache of desires that his illness only magnified. The physicians advised travel, the air of the sea, the son of southern lands. Alma accompanied him on voyages that were meant to heal, journeys across waters where waves broke endlessly against the hull, their rhythm both soothing and unrelenting. On deck, Gustav would wrap himself in blankets, gazing out at the horizon, silent, withdrawn, his face gaunt, his eyes heavy with fatigue. Alma would stand nearby, the wind lifting her hair, her gaze turning not only to him, but also outward, toward the world that seemed so vast and filled with possibilities he might never again touch. On one such voyage, they traveled to America, where Mahler was invited to conduct in New York. The ocean crossing was long, and Alma's diary speaks of the melancholy of endless waters, the horizon always distant, the sense of being suspended between continents. Mahler, despite his weakness, carried himself with determination, for even illness could not wholly silence his drive. He rehearsed, he conducted, he poured what strength remained into the music. Alma watched him, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with weariness, sometimes with despair, for she saw not only the greatness but also the fragility, and she knew the shadow was lengthening. In those years, her inner conflict grew sharper. Her devotion to Gustav was real, yet her yearning for Walter Gropius still smoldered. She wrote letters, received them, concealed them, lived in a state of duality that gnawed at her conscience, but also gave her life a certain intensity. To nurse a dying man while carrying a secret passion for another is a paradox almost unbearable, and Alma bore it with the composure that had become her mask. Mahler, perhaps sensing what remained unspoken, drew ever closer to her, leaning on her not only for care but for affirmation. He sought her opinion on his works, shared his fears, confessed his dreams. In these exchanges, Alma felt again the pull of being indispensable, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in his darkest hours, he depended upon her utterly. Yet she also felt the suffocation of such dependence, for it demanded from her a constancy that her heart could not sustain. Imagine the scene of one evening on their ocean voyage, Mahler reclining in a deck chair, wrapped in blankets, the lamps along the ship flickering in the wind. Alma stands beside him, her hand resting lightly on the wooden rail. The air smells of salt and coal smoke. The sea shudders beneath them. Mahler turns his face toward her, his eyes tired, his voice faint but steady as he speaks of a passage in his latest symphony, the way he wishes it to rise like a hymn before falling back into quiet. Alma listens, nods, offers a word of encouragement. Yet in her heart, another image arises of Gropius's letters, filled with longing and promise, waiting to be read in solitude. The moment passes, and she remains silent, the conflict contained within her. Their time in America brought both triumph and strain. Mahler's performances were acclaimed, his reputation spread across the Atlantic. Yet the exertion cost him dearly. His body weakened further, his steps slower, his breath shorter. Alma, though admired in society, carried the private burden of his illness, arranging for his care, shielding him from fatigue, enduring the endless rhythm of medicines, rest, and worry. She was both wife and nurse, her identity once again subsumed into the needs of another. But even as she played this role, the shadow of betrayal lingered. Her meetings with Gropius, though rare, were intense, filled with urgency. She had not relinquished him, nor he her. The tension of divided loyalties marked her every act, even as she pressed cool cloths to Gustav's forehead, even as she guided his steps along a gangway. It is this tension, perhaps, that made her story so endlessly debated. Was she faithless or simply human, caught between devotion and desire, between duty and longing? The sound that lingers from these voyages is the soft clink of a medicine bottle set upon a bedside table, the faint odor of tincture filling the room. Mahler lies resting. Alma nearby, the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The silence is heavy, punctuated only by the ship's engines or by the distant cries of seabirds when near a coast. The atmosphere is one of waiting, waiting for recovery, waiting for decline, waiting for the inevitable. And Alma, in this suspended time, must have asked herself questions she could never answer. Was she betraying him by loving another, or was she betraying herself by denying her own heart? Was loyalty a matter of body or of spirit? Was it possible to serve one man's genius while still yearning for another's passion? These questions lingered, unanswered, as the voyages stretched on, as the medicines continued, as Gustav's strength ebbed. The final image of this chapter is the lingering smell of medicine in the room long after the bottle has been removed, a scent that clings to the air and to memory alike. It is a reminder that illness does not vanish easily, that even in moments of respite, the shadow remains. And from that lingering scent, Alma's story turns toward the inevitable, the final years of Gustav Mahler and the role she would play as his last witness and his widow. The lingering smell of medicine remained in the room, clinging even when the bottles were gone, a ghost of illness that settled into the fabric of Alma's days. From that faint but inescapable scent, the story turns to its next silence, the silence that followed Gustav Mahler's death. It was in the spring of 1911, in Vienna, that the composer, already weakened by heart disease, surrendered at last to the body's limits. Alma, who had been his caretaker through voyages and sickness, through despair and brief recoveries, became in that moment not only widow but custodian of a legacy that would outlive them both. The final days were marked by exhaustion and inevitability. Mahler, once a figure of commanding presence, was reduced to fragility, his movements slow, his words faint. Alma remained near, attentive yet torn, still haunted by her divided affections. Even as she pressed his hand in those last hours, she carried within her the memory of her betrayal, of letters exchanged with Walter Gropius, of passions unfulfilled. Did she regret, in that moment, the secrecy that had marked their marriage? Or did she feel only the immensity of impending loss? The truth is unknowable, and perhaps even to Alma herself it was veiled. When Mahler died on May 18th, Alma was 31 years old, still young, still filled with vitality, but marked by the shadows of grief and conflict. The house grew unbearably quiet. The rooms that had echoed with rehearsals, with the scrawling of notes upon manuscripts, with Mahler's sharp commands, now resounded only with absence. The piano sat closed, its keys untouched, the air heavy with memory. Alma dressed in black, as was the custom, her beauty veiled, her expression composed yet somber. The role of widow descended upon her like a cloak, at once a badge of sorrow and of authority. Vienna, ever conscious of appearances, watched her closely. She was admired for her composure, pitied for her loss, whispered about for her affairs. Some saw her as the devoted wife of a genius, others as the restless woman whose infidelity had hastened his decline. Yet to Alma, public opinion mattered less than the private reckoning she endured. She wrote in her diary of her loneliness, of the emptiness of nights without him, of the haunting sense that she had been left behind not only by a husband, but by a destiny once shared. In those months of mourning, Alma occupied an uneasy space between reverence and liberation. On the one hand, she was the widow of Gustav Mahler, her life forever linked with his towering genius. His symphonies, performed across Europe and America, carried his name into immortality, and Alma was seen as guardian of that flame. On the other hand, she was suddenly free from the silence he had imposed upon her, free from the duty of serving his every need. Widowhood, for her, was both loss and possibility, both ache and temptation. She arranged for the publication of his works, corresponded with conductors, ensured that his reputation would endure. In this role, she was tireless, almost devoted beyond measure, as though by securing his immortality, she might absolve herself of guilt. Yet at the same time, she re-entered society with renewed vigor, her beauty once more unshrouded, her wit once more displayed in salons and gatherings. Admirers circled her, eager to console, eager to claim her attention, eager perhaps to step into the space Mahler had left. One of the most intense of these admirers was the painter Oskar Kokoschka, whose obsession with Alma would soon become legend. But before his arrival, Alma lingered in her widowhood, caught between shadow and light. She wrote letters to friends filled with melancholy, yet she also accepted invitations to dinners and concerts. Her presence noted in the papers, her beauty remarked upon as undiminished. To some, she seemed restless, unable to remain cloistered in grief. To others, she embodied the resilience of a woman who refused to fade. Imagine her in her apartment in Vienna, dressed in black, standing before the window as twilight settles over the city. The streets hum, faintly with carriages, with voices, with the life of a city that continues despite her loss. Behind her on a chair lies the black veil she has worn throughout the day. She does not put it away, nor does she put it on again. She simply stands, gazing outward, torn between the roles of widow and woman, between memory and desire. The silence of the room presses upon her, and she wonders whether she is mourning Gustav or mourning the life she surrendered to him. Mahler's music surrounded her even in his absence. Performances were dedicated to his memory. Symphonies thundered with his name. Critics declared him a prophet misunderstood in his lifetime. Alma attended these concerts, seated among dignitaries and admirers, her expression calm, yet unreadable. Did she hear in those notes her own sacrifice, her own silenced voice, her own love and betrayal intertwined? Or did she hear only Gustav, monumental, unreachable, now forever beyond her? In her widowhood, Alma began to rewrite her own story, as she would continue to do throughout her life. She cast herself as the indispensable partner, the muse without whom Mahler's greatness would have faltered. She spoke of his dependence on her, of her insight into his works, of the ways she had sustained him. Whether these claims were truth, exaggeration, or self-defense remains uncertain. But what is clear is that Alma refused to be a mere footnote. Even in grief, she asserted her place in history. The image that lingers at the end of this chapter is that of a black veil resting on a chair. It is not worn, not folded away, but lying in waiting, a symbol of both mourning and transition. The veil belongs to Alma, yet Alma belongs neither wholly to mourning nor wholly to freedom. She stands between uncertain, restless, already poised to step into another story, another passion, another scandal. And from this image of the veil, left behind on a chair, the next part of her journey begins, as into her life enters the fiery presence of a painter who would capture her image and obsession in strokes of color that have not yet faded. The black veil lay upon the chair, not folded with care, nor draped in ceremony, but left as if abandoned, a garment caught between purpose and irrelevance. From that veil, the story moves into color, into brushstrokes, into the world of Oskar Kokoschka, the painter whose passion for Alma Mahler would transform both their lives into a storm of obsession. If the veil had muted her presence in the aftermath of widowhood, Kokoschka's gaze tore it away and replaced it with the intensity of a canvas, a flame of pigment that refused to fade. They met not long after Gustav's death, when Alma was still the widow adorned in black, yet already restless, already glancing toward the possibilities of life beyond mourning. Kokoschka, a rising figure in Vienna's modern art, was young, volatile, unafraid of scandal. His paintings pulsed with raw energy, with distortions that revealed not likeness, but essence. When his eyes fell upon Alma, he did not see only beauty or widowhood or muse. He saw a figure through which his own restless creativity could be channeled. To him, she became not merely a woman, but the very embodiment of desire, destruction, and inspiration. Alma, accustomed to admiration, was startled by the intensity of Kokoschka's pursuit. He courted her with a ferocity unlike the polished attentions of society men. His letters blazed with passion, his words unrestrained, urgent. He sketched her obsessively, as though his hand could not move quickly enough to capture what his mind conjured. Alma, both flattered and unsettled, responded with a mixture of surrender and resistance, for she was drawn to the vitality he exuded, the way he made her feel central once more. Yet she was wary of the chaos that seemed to swirl around him. Their affair ignited quickly, and with it came scandal. Kokoschka's paintings of Alma revealed her not as society wished to see her, composed, elegant, veiled, but as a figure of raw sensuality, her form twisted with longing, her eyes ablaze with torment. In his brushstrokes she became larger than life, a mythic presence. Alma herself, who had once silenced her own art for Gustav, now became art incarnate, a canvas upon which another man's genius proclaimed itself. Did she resent this, or did she revel in it? Perhaps both, for Alma's life was always lived in the tension between being creator and creation. Theirs was no gentle romance. It was tempestuous, filled with quarrels and reconciliations, with jealousies and ecstasies. Kokoschka's possessiveness grew consuming. He wanted Alma not only in life but also in eternity, his love expressed in words of violence as much as of tenderness. Alma, who had known the strict severity of Gustav and the admiring devotion of Gropius, now found herself engulfed by an intensity that left her both exhilarated and suffocated. Her diary reveals moments of fear, of exhaustion, yet also of fascination. She could not let him go, nor could she wholly surrender to him. Vienna whispered. The widow of Mahler entwined with a painter known for scandalous art, their love carried out with little disguise. Friends warned her, critics mocked her, but Alma seemed to move heedless of reputation. Perhaps she had grown weary of restraint. Perhaps she longed, after years of silence and loss, to feel life in its fiercest form. With Kokoschka, she experienced that, though it came at the cost of peace. Imagine them in his studio, canvases leaning against walls, the smell of turpentine thick in the air, the floor scattered with brushes. Alma sits posed, not in the elegant posture of a salon portrait, but slouched, weary, her gaze a mixture of defiance and surrender. Kokoschka stands before her, brush in hand, eyes blazing, his movements rapid, almost violent. The canvas before him swells with color, with distortion, with emotion made visible. Alma watches, perhaps flattered, perhaps disturbed, as she is transformed into a figure both recognizable and alien. In those moments, she ceased to belong to herself. She belonged to the vision he imposed. Their affair, however, was doomed by its very intensity. Kokoschka demanded more than Alma was willing to give. Absolute fidelity, absolute surrender. Alma, ever restless, ever unwilling to be wholly possessed, resisted. Quarrels grew sharper, reconciliations shorter. The relationship burned with a flame that consumed rather than warmed. Alma began to pull away, seeking respite from the suffocating devotion. Kokoschka, in turn, grew more desperate, his love curdling into obsession. When finally Alma ended the relationship, his devastation knew no bounds. Unable to accept her absence, he sought to recreate her presence in the most disturbing of ways. He commissioned a life-size doll in her likeness, a grotesque effigy meant to soothe his longing. The doll, dressed and arranged as though it were Alma herself, became a symbol of his obsession, a macabre testament to a love that had turned into fixation. Vienna laughed, whispered, recoiled, yet Kokoschka clung to it as though by possessing the image he could hold the woman who had slipped from his grasp. For Alma, the end of the affair was both liberation and shadow. She had tasted again the intensity of being Muse, of being central, yet she had also felt the danger of being consumed by another's vision. She carried forward both pride and weariness, knowing that in Kokoschka's paintings she would remain immortalized, yet also knowing that she had been, once again, more canvas than composer. The final image of this chapter is of a canvas, paint still wet, brush strokes thick and uneven, the figure of a woman emerging not as she was but as she was imagined. The smell of oil lingers, the studio quiet after the storm of creation. The canvas waits, silent, a testimony to a love too fierce to last. And from this unfinished canvas, still glistening with wet paint, the story turns toward another structure, another union, as Alma steps once more into marriage, this time with the architect who had first awakened her longing amidst grief, Walter Gropius. The canvas remained wet, the paint glistening in the dim light of the studio, its colors shifting with the shadows. And from that unfinished surface, we move into the unsettling aftermath of Oskar Kokoschka's love, an aftermath that took shape not in living flesh, but in artifice. For when Alma left him, when her presence could no longer be summoned to his side, Kokoschka sought to recreate her in a form that would neither argue nor abandon. He commissioned a doll, a life-sized effigy made in her likeness, stitched from fabric and fur, shaped by artisans under his precise instruction. What emerged was no delicate figurine, but a grotesque substitute, uncanny in its attempt at humanity, a reminder that obsession, when denied, may contort itself into strange creations. Vienna whispered and laughed when word of the doll spread. Kokoschka paraded it as though it were Alma herself, dressing it in fine clothes, seating it at the table, even taking it with him to the opera. Guests were startled, some amused, others disturbed, by the sight of this silent companion, its eyes vacant, its body pliant, its presence a parody of the living woman who had once inspired him. For Kokoschka, the doll was both consolation and punishment, a way to keep Alma near and a way to mock the pain her absence had caused. For Alma, who heard of it through friends and gossip, the doll was an insult, a wound, a grotesque mirror of the power she wielded over men's imaginations. Yet perhaps it was also a dark confirmation of her significance. For how many women are loved so fiercely that, when gone, their likeness is recreated in such bizarre devotion? Alma, who had long balanced between being creator and being creation, saw in the doll the ultimate symbol of her role as Muse, an object made in her image, silent, passive, existing only to reflect the desires of another. It was a cruel reflection, one that forced her to confront the ways in which she was both exalted and diminished by those who claimed to love her. The doll eventually met its end at a drunken party, when Kokoschka, enraged by its inadequacy, destroyed it with violent gestures. Guests looked on as wine was poured over its cloth body, as its seams tore, as the grotesque Alma was cast aside. The destruction was both theatrical and inevitable, a final act in a drama that had blurred the line between love and obsession. For Kokoschka, it was perhaps a release. For Alma, it was a humiliation mingled with relief. The chapter of their storm had closed, but its echoes lingered in paint, in memory, in whispers that would follow her long after. What remains striking in this episode is the question it raises. Was Alma a victim of such obsessions, or did she, by her very nature, invite them? She inspired men to create, but creation requires projection, and projection transforms the beloved into something more or less than herself. Alma was adored, painted, pursued, immortalized, yet rarely was she simply allowed to exist as Alma, with her own desires, her own unfinished compositions, her own contradictions. The doll was grotesque, yes, but it was also a metaphor for the fate she carried, always remade in the eyes of others, always held as an image rather than as a whole. After Kokoschka, Alma sought stability, a life less turbulent, though not less significant. The figure who returned to her, steady and persistent, was Walter Gropius, the architect with whom she had once kindled an affair during her marriage to Mahler. Their connection, interrupted by grief, betrayal, and time, now offered itself again, this time with the promise of permanence. Gropius was not a man of flamboyant obsessions, but of disciplined vision, a creator of structures, of order, of spaces meant to endure. For Alma, weary of storms, his presence must have seemed a kind of shelter, though she would not remain sheltered for long. Their union in 1915 was marked by both hope and uncertainty. Europe was in the grip of war, Vienna shrouded in anxiety, and the world Alma had once known, of glittering salons, of artistic triumphs, was breaking apart. Gropius, serving as an officer, often absent, left Alma once more in the position of waiting, of longing, of filling her loneliness with thoughts that reached beyond marriage. Yet in those first months their love seemed sincere, a bond not of obsession but of mutual respect. Alma admired his work, his vision of modern architecture that sought to dissolve barriers between function and beauty. He, in turn, admired her wit, her vitality, her ability to inspire. Their daughter, Manon, born in 1916, brought with her a new chapter of hope, a fragile continuation of life after so much death. Alma cherished her, perhaps with even greater intensity because of the loss she had suffered with Puzzi. Yet as history would later show, even this new life carried its own shadows, for tragedy seemed always to return to Alma's side. For now, though, the infant's presence softened the edges of her restlessness, and Gropius's affection provided a structure upon which she might lean. Still, Alma was not made for contentment alone. Her heart, quick to ignite, soon strayed again, this time toward Franz Werfel, the writer who would later become her third husband. Even in the midst of marriage to Gropius, the pattern repeated. Devotion mingled with betrayal, loyalty with yearning. Alma's story, once more, unfolded not as a straight line, but as a series of overlapping melodies, dissonant yet inseparable. Imagine her seated in a room designed with Gropius's precise modern sensibilities. Clean lines, light streaming in, the air uncluttered. Alma sits at the piano, her hands resting idly on the keys, while in the corner lies a letter from Werfel, words of longing and promise etched in hurried ink. She glances at it, then away, torn between the order of her present and the lure of her future. The house is silent, but within her, the familiar turbulence rises again. The transition from Kokoschka's violent obsession to Gropius's measured devotion reveals the duality of Alma's existence. She was sought by men of genius, yet never fully satisfied by any of them. She longed for stability, yet resisted its confines. She desired passion, yet recoiled from its consuming fire. Her life, like a piece of music unresolved, shifted endlessly between major and minor, between harmony and discord. And so this chapter ends not with destruction, as Kokoschka's doll had ended, nor with serenity, as Gropius's architecture promised, but with the image of scaffolding left half-constructed, a framework rising against the sky, incomplete, awaiting its final form. Alma, once again, was at the center of something unfinished, poised between what had been destroyed and what had yet to be built. The scaffolding rose against the sky, incomplete, waiting for walls that had not yet been set, beams that had not yet been secured. And it is from that half-built structure that we enter Alma's marriage to Walter Gropius, a union that promised permanence but soon revealed its own fragility. For Alma, who had endured Mahler's severity and Kokoschka's obsession, now turned toward the steady presence of the architect, hoping perhaps that the geometry of his vision might stabilize the restless patterns of her life. Walter Gropius was a man of discipline, his imagination directed toward form, function, and the future. He dreamed of buildings that opened themselves to light, of houses that served not merely as shelters, but as expressions of clarity. In his presence, Alma found a kind of order, a rationality that contrasted sharply with the storm of Kokoschka's canvases and the consuming intensity of Mahler's symphonies. Their union in 1915 seemed to offer the possibility of structure, not only in architecture, but in marriage, in family, in the contours of daily life. The war, however, cast its shadow across their early years. Gropius was often absent, serving as an officer, while Alma remained behind in Vienna. Letters passed between them, words of affection mingled with the anxieties of separation. She admired his courage, his vision, his devotion, yet she also felt the loneliness of his absence keenly. The rhythms of war are long, and Alma, who craved presence and vitality, struggled with the emptiness. She was once again in the role of waiting, a role she had played too many times before. In 1916, their daughter Manon was born, a fragile light in the darkness of war. Alma cherished her deeply, perhaps with the more fervent love of one who had already lost a child. She held the infant close, gazed upon her as though she were both gift and promise, a continuation of life after grief. The small sounds of Manon filled the household, her cries, her laughter, her first words, and Alma found herself softened by motherhood once more. Yet beneath that tenderness, the old restlessness stirred. For Alma was not built for stillness, nor for confinement within any one role. Even as she embraced her child, even as she honored her husband, she found herself drawn again toward other voices, other presences. It was in these years that Franz Werfel entered her orbit, the writer whose warmth and vitality would later eclipse her devotion to Gropius. The pattern repeated, Alma torn between duty and desire, between the structures she inhabited and the passions that beckoned beyond them. Gropius, for all his steadiness, was not blind to her restlessness. He sensed her distractions, her divided affections, and though he sought to hold her with patience, the fracture widened. Alma admired his genius, respected his vision, but she did not feel consumed by him as she had by Mahler or Kokoschka. And perhaps for Alma, to not be consumed was itself a kind of dissatisfaction. She needed both the steadiness of order and the intoxication of passion, and rarely did these two exist within one man. Imagine Alma in one of Gropius's modern interiors, the walls stripped of ornament, the windows open to light, the furniture designed with precision. She sits in a chair of clean lines, her figure a contrast of elegance against simplicity. On the table beside her lies a letter, perhaps from Werfel, perhaps from another admirer, its ink fresh, its words of longing spilling across the page. She picks it up, reads, sets it down again, her face unreadable. The architecture around her promises clarity, but her inner world remains clouded with contradictions. The paradox of their marriage lay in this very contrast. Gropius built structures meant to endure, yet his union with Alma was fraught with impermanence. He sought to bring order. She carried within her the storm. He dreamed of collective harmony. She longed for personal exaltation. The scaffolding of their marriage remained, but the walls cracked. The beams wavered, the structure incomplete. Still, Alma did not leave him at once. She remained, caring for their daughter, sharing in his vision, accompanying him when possible. Their life together was not without tenderness, nor without admiration, but the passion that Alma craved was missing, and the presence of Werfel grew stronger, his words, his companionship, his devotion weaving themselves into her days. Alma moved again into the role that seemed to define her, the woman between men, the muse torn between stability and desire, between what she was offered and what she longed for. Vienna, too, was changing. The war had unsettled the empire, the old world crumbling as new movements rose. The salons of Alma's youth, glittering with music and art, gave way to conversations marked by politics, by survival, by the anxieties of a collapsing order. Alma navigated this shifting landscape with the same grace she had always displayed, yet she must have felt the instability deeply. For a woman who had built her life on the admiration of men of genius, the world itself seemed to echo her own contradictions, half constructed, half collapsing, uncertain of its future. The image that closes this chapter is again that of scaffolding, not yet dismantled, not yet complete, rising against a sky streaked with uncertainty. The beams creak in the wind, the boards tremble under the weight of footsteps. Alma stands nearby, gazing upward, knowing that this structure may never be finished, that it may collapse before its form is realized. And yet she remains, caught between admiration for its design and longing for something less steady, more consuming. And from this image of scaffolding trembling in the wind, the story turns to words written on a page, to the whispers of poetry and devotion, as Franz Werfel enters more fully into Alma's life, bringing with him the promise of literature, of warmth, and of yet another transformation. The scaffolding trembled in the wind, beams creaking, unfinished, yet suggestive of form, and from that wavering framework the story moves toward words written on a page, words that carried warmth where structure could not. Franz Werfel entered Alma's life not with the clean lines of architecture, but with the soft persistence of literature, sentences woven with tenderness, with reverence, with the breath of longing. If Gropius represented order, Werfel embodied expression, and Alma, restless as ever, found herself drawn once more to the vitality of another's devotion. Franz Werfel was younger than Alma, a writer whose plays and poems carried a mix of passion and moral inquiry. His presence was less commanding than Mahler's, less consuming than Kokoschka's, less precise than Gropius's, but it was warmer, more human, more attuned to affection than authority. To Alma, accustomed to men who demanded sacrifice, Werfel's admiration felt like balm. He did not ask her to renounce. He did not paint her into distortion. He did not build around her. He simply addressed her with words of devotion, words that suggested she was not only muse, but also partner, not only inspiration, but also beloved. Their bond began in secrecy, in letters exchanged when Gropius was absent, in quiet conversations at gatherings, in glances that lingered longer than courtesy allowed. Alma was once again caught between duty and desire, between the unfinished structure of her marriage and the unfolding page of Werfel's affection. She resisted at first, or so she later claimed, but resistance was never Alma's lasting posture. Slowly, inevitably, she yielded, and in yielding she found once again the thrill of being central to another's creative life. Werfel adored her with an earnestness that contrasted sharply with the possessive demands of Kokoschka or the stern severity of Mahler. His words celebrated her not as symbol but as presence, not as image but as person. Alma, who had so often been turned into canvas, into silence, into scaffolding, felt the difference keenly. She responded with warmth, with trust, with an openness that surprised even herself. Yet even in this tenderness there lingered the familiar shadow of betrayal, for she was still Gropius's wife, still mother to his daughter. The pattern repeated, but the tone shifted. This was not storm, but glow, not thunder, but candlelight. Vienna, in those years after the war, was a city of hunger and uncertainty. The empire had collapsed. The salons were no longer filled with glittering certainty, but with weary debates about survival, about the future of art in a world broken by conflict. Alma moved through these gatherings with her usual grace, but now her hand often rested lightly on Werfel's arm, her gaze turned toward him with unmistakable affection. Those who knew her whispered again, as they always had, but Alma seemed less concerned with their judgments. Perhaps she had grown used to scandal, or perhaps she had decided at last to claim happiness where she found it. Gropius, though wounded, recognized the fracture in their marriage. He had sought to hold Alma with patience, but patience was not enough. Their union, never truly solid, began to crumble, and Alma stepped more fully into her life with Werfel. She moved from scaffolding into sentences, from unfinished beams into flowing prose. For Werfel's devotion was not only private, but public. He dedicated works to her, celebrated her openly, wove her presence into his art. Alma, who had long feared being forgotten, found reassurance in these gestures. She was not only muse but subject, not only inspiration but acknowledgement. Imagine Alma seated at a small desk, a letter from Werfel unfolded before her. The ink glistens faintly, the lines of his handwriting curving with urgency. He writes of love, of admiration, of the way her presence steadies him amidst the uncertainties of the age. Alma reads slowly, her eyes tracing each word, her lips curving into a faint smile. Outside, the city struggles with shortages, with unrest, with the weight of defeat. But inside the room, Alma feels a warmth that softens the hardness of the world. She places the letter gently beside her, as though it were not merely paper, but a fragile artifact of devotion. Her diaries from this time reveal a calmer tone than in earlier years. She wrote less of despair, less of suffocation, more of gratitude, of tenderness. She spoke of Werfel as a man who gave without demanding, who cherished without consuming. Whether this was entirely true, or whether Alma wished to believe it, hardly matters. For in those years, she found in him the presence she had long sought, a companion who did not silence her, who did not demand her sacrifice, who allowed her to be both admired and free. Yet freedom is never simple. Alma remained marked by her past, by the music she had silenced, by the betrayals she had committed, by the roles she had played. Even in Werfel's affection, she must have felt the weight of those contradictions. Could she ever be simply Alma? Or would she always be Mahler's widow, Gropius's wife, Kokoschka's muse? Werfel's devotion eased the burden, but it could not erase it. Alma carried her past like a shadow, inseparable, unrelenting. Theirs was not a relationship free of conflict. No bond of Alma's ever was. There were quarrels, insecurities, moments of distance. But unlike the storms of Kokoschka or the silences of Mahler, these conflicts often resolved in reconciliation, in the reaffirmation of tenderness. Werfel's temperament was more forgiving, his love more resilient. Alma, in turn, seemed willing to accept his imperfections, perhaps because he accepted hers. As the 1920s unfolded, Alma and Werfel became a pair in public as well as in private. They traveled together, appeared together, their union less a scandal than an inevitability. Gropius receded into distance, their marriage dissolved, their daughter Manon left in the shared care of both parents. Alma had chosen again, as she always did, and the choice carried her forward into yet another life. The image that lingers at the close of this chapter is of words whispered onto a page. Werfel, writing in the dim light of a lamp, his pen moving swiftly, his thoughts flowing toward Alma. The room is quiet, the world outside unsettled, but within that moment there is only the connection between writer and beloved, between ink and gaze, between devotion and memory. And from these whispered words, still glistening on paper, the story turns toward the larger gatherings of Berlin, where Alma once again entered the orbit of salons and conversations, her presence admired, her role debated, her influence undiminished. The whispered words upon the page glistened faintly in the lamplight, Werfel's pen still warm from its passage, and from that hush of private devotion, we step into a larger room filled with voices, the murmur of a crowd where words did not stay upon paper, but moved freely in the air. Berlin in the 1920s was a city of contradictions, both ruin and renewal, its avenues scarred by war yet alive with creativity, its cafes filled with arguments about art, politics, and the uncertain future. It was here that Alma Mahler, now no longer only widow nor only wife, moved with the same commanding presence that had marked her Viennese youth. Her arrival at gatherings turned heads. Her beauty, though touched by years, still glowed, and her wit, sharpened with experience, drew listeners close. In these salons she was both participant and spectacle. Writers, painters, composers, and politicians crowded together in smoke-filled rooms, their voices rising in debate, their laughter sudden, their quarrels fierce. Alma entered with Werfel at her side, yet she never blended into his shadow. She remained a figure in her own right, greeted with reverence, with curiosity, with envy. Some saw her as Muse, the woman who had passed from Mahler to Gropius to Kokoschka to Werfel, collecting genius as others might collect jewels. Others despised her for the same reason, accusing her of vanity, of ambition, of destroying the men who loved her. Alma listened, smiled, and moved through the room as though such judgments were no more than passing smoke. For Alma, these gatherings were not merely diversions, but continuations of her role as intermediary between creation and society. She spoke with painters about color, with musicians about harmony, with poets about rhythm. Her insights were sharp, sometimes cutting, yet always memorable. She did not flatter. She challenged. Those who underestimated her beauty often found themselves startled by the force of her intelligence. In this way, she carved a space for herself in Berlin's cultural elite, not as artist in her own right, but as something harder to define, a presence, a catalyst, a woman whose very being seemed to ignite the imagination of others. Werfel thrived in her company, though he must have known that her magnetism drew attention away from him at times. He was devoted, protective, eager to shelter her from the harsher criticisms of their circle. Alma, for her part, enjoyed the balance. In him she found tenderness, in society she found recognition, and in herself she found the ability to bridge the two. Yet even amidst admiration, she felt the undercurrent of resentment, the whispers of those who questioned whether her role was earned or merely borrowed. Was she truly a force in culture, or was she only the echo of the men she loved? Alma herself posed this question often in her writings, though never with finality. Berlin itself mirrored her contradictions. By day, its streets bore the scars of economic hardship, of inflation so severe that fortunes could vanish in an hour. By night, it shimmered with performance, with cabaret, with experimentation in every form of art. Alma and Werfel lived at the center of this duality, attending soirees where despair was masked by laughter, where politics hovered behind every jest, where art carried both frivolity and urgency. In such a city, Alma felt both at home and displaced. At home because she thrived in the pulse of conversation, displaced because the world she had known in Vienna, the empire, the certainty, the gilded salons, was gone forever. Imagine her at one of these evenings, seated on a low couch, a glass of wine in her hand. Around her, the smoke curls upward, the sound of a piano drifts faintly from another room, voices rise and fall like waves. A young painter gestures wildly as he speaks of form. A philosopher interrupts, laughter breaks out, then a quarrel. Alma leans forward, her eyes alive, offering a remark that silences the group, not with cruelty but with clarity. All turn toward her, and for a moment she holds the room, not as ornament but as authority. Werfel, seated nearby, smiles quietly, watching her claim once again the role that had always been hers. Yet beneath the glitter of these evenings lay unease. The political winds were shifting, and though many dismissed the loud voices of extremism as temporary noise, Alma was not blind to the dangers. She wrote of her fears, of the sense that Europe was heading toward another storm. Her own life, marked by upheaval, seemed to prepare her for the recognition that stability is always fragile. She thrived in the present, but she carried within her the knowledge that the present never lasts. Her diaries from this period reveal both pride and weariness. She enjoyed the admiration she received, the centrality of her role, but she also confessed to fatigue, to the sense that she was always performing, always embodying expectations that others had cast upon her. Even in Werfel's devotion, even in the circle of Berlin's artists, she longed at times for quiet, for simplicity, for the chance to be only Alma. But such a chance never truly came. Her identity was too entangled with the histories she carried. The paradox of her Berlin years lies in this. She was both admired and despised, central yet peripheral, celebrated yet doubted. She moved with ease among the intellectual elite, yet she was always shadowed by her past. Her presence was undeniable, but its meaning was endlessly debated. Was she a muse or a manipulator? A woman of insight or merely of charm? Alma herself never resolved the question, and perhaps that was the point. Her power lay in ambiguity, in the refusal to be defined too narrowly. The murmur of the crowded room fades now, the voices dissolving into silence, the smoke drifting away. What remains is the faint trace of her perfume, the memory of her remark, the impression she left upon those who heard her. Alma moved on, but the echo lingered, as it always did. And so this chapter closes with that murmur dissolving into quiet, a crowded room left suddenly empty, the sound of conversations fading like waves receding from the shore. From that fading murmur, the story will move into a quieter space, into the secrecy of letters and meetings, as Alma's bond with Werfel deepens, pulling her further from the structures of her past and closer to the intimacy of chosen devotion. The murmur of the crowded room dissolved into silence, smoke dispersing into the night, and from that fading chorus we move into the secrecy of letters and the weight of promises whispered in private. Alma, who had always lived at the intersection of admiration and scandal, now found herself more fully entwined with Franz Werfel, the writer whose devotion had grown into a constant presence. If Berlin's gatherings gave her recognition, Werfel's companionship gave her warmth, and from this warmth emerged not only comfort, but commitment, though fidelity in Alma's world was never a simple or unbroken vow. Her life with Gropius had already begun to disintegrate, its structure unable to contain the currents of her restlessness. The architect had built forms of clarity, yet Alma's desires moved in shifting patterns that no geometry could hold. She had turned toward Werfel first in secrecy, then in increasing openness, until at last the pretense of marriage to Gropius could no longer be sustained. Their union dissolved, and Alma stepped fully into her new bond, a transition that was at once scandalous and inevitable. Werfel adored her with a constancy she had rarely known. His love did not come with the stern demands of Mahler, nor with the violent obsession of Kokoschka, nor with the austere structures of Gropius. Instead, it came as a steady flame, bright enough to warm, but not fierce enough to consume. Alma, who had so often been made to yield, found in him a partner who seemed content to let her exist as she was. In his letters, he celebrated her wit, her insight, her beauty, her very presence as though it were a source of creative light. She, in turn, responded with an openness that surprised even herself, though she was never without the sharp edge of doubt. Could such constancy satisfy her, or would she again grow restless, longing for storms rather than for calm? Her diaries reveal this ambivalence. She wrote of Werfel with tenderness, of the way his presence eased her loneliness, of the gratitude she felt for his devotion, yet she also confessed her uncertainty, her fear that comfort might slip into dullness, that affection might pale without passion. Fidelity, for Alma, was not a matter of exclusion but of intensity. She measured love not by constancy alone, but by the depth of its flame, and flames, by nature, flicker. Still in Werfel, she found a partner willing to endure her contradictions. He knew her past, knew the pattern of betrayals and scandals, yet chose to remain. He accepted not only her beauty, but her volatility, not only her presence, but her absences. To Alma, this acceptance must have felt like freedom, though she did not always honor it with reciprocity. For even as she grew more committed to Werfel, she did not entirely abandon the thrill of other attentions. Letters from admirers, fleeting flirtations, glances exchanged in salons, these remained as though she could not wholly renounce the currency that had defined her since youth. Werfel bore this with patience, though not without pain. His writings of the period suggest a man deeply in love, yet often anxious, aware that the woman he cherished could not be held by devotion alone. Alma, for her part, balanced affection with freedom, sincerity with ambiguity. To some, this made her cruel. To others, it made her human, refusing to submit entirely to the demands of fidelity as convention defined it. Imagine her seated in a quiet room, the remnants of a gathering still lingering in the air. Empty glasses, scattered programs, a candle flickering low. On the table lies a letter from Werfel, folded and refolded, its paper softened by her handling. She reads it again, though she already knows its words by heart. Declarations of love, promises of constancy, reassurances that she is his muse, his compass, his joy. Alma smiles, touched, then sets the letter down and gazes into the flame of the candle. The flame bends, wavers, almost extinguishes, then steadies itself. In that flicker, she sees the image of their bond, fragile yet enduring, vulnerable yet persistent. She sighs, uncertain whether such steadiness will be enough, yet unwilling to let it go. Fidelity, in Alma's world, was never absolute. It was not the absence of others, but the persistence of one. She might entertain admirers, might indulge in flirtations, but Werfel remained the anchor, the figure to whom she returned, the one who endured. In this way, she redefined fidelity not as exclusivity, but as resilience, a bond that survived even the breaches. Such a redefinition scandalized some, puzzled others, but it was true to Alma's nature. She demanded freedom even as she demanded devotion, and Werfel, remarkably, gave her both. The years of their growing bond were marked by travel, by evenings spent in conversation, by the weaving together of lives once separate. Werfel wrote plays and novels. Alma offered her counsel, her criticism, her encouragement. In his works, her presence was felt, sometimes directly, sometimes in shadows. She was his muse, yes, but she was also his critic, his sounding board, his partner in thought. Unlike Mahler, he did not demand that she silence herself. Unlike Kokoschka, he did not distort her into image alone. He allowed her voice, though she used it less for her own creations than for shaping his. Still, the old question lingered. Was this enough for Alma? To live through another's art? To be reflected rather than origin? Her own songs remained in drawers, her diaries her only direct expression. She had chosen again the path of Muse, though this time willingly, perhaps even gratefully. But the shadow of her own suppressed music remained, and perhaps it always would. The image that closes this chapter is of 2 letters left unopened upon a table. One from Werfel, steady in its devotion, another from an admirer, eager and insistent. Alma glances at them both, her hand hovering, her heart torn not between loyalty and betrayal, but between the need for constancy and the lure of novelty. She leaves them unopened, for the choice need not be made in haste. The letters remain, silent witnesses to the ambiguity of fidelity in her world. And from these 2 unopened letters, the story turns outward again, toward the shifting world around her, toward the turbulence of interwar Europe, where Alma's personal contradictions would meet the larger contradictions of a continent sliding toward darkness. The 2 unopened letters lay upon the table, silent in their waiting, paper folded over words that might alter nothing or everything, and from their stillness the story widens outward to the letters written by nations, by governments, by history itself. For as Alma balanced constancy and desire in her private life, the world around her began to tip toward upheaval, the fragile structures of peace creaking under the strain of anger and ideology. The interwar years unfolded like a long breath, held too long, heavy with foreboding, and Alma, ever moving within the circles of artists and thinkers, could not escape the turbulence. The cafes and salons of Vienna and Berlin still hummed with conversation, but the tone had shifted. Where once the arguments had been about art and beauty, now politics intruded with a harshness that could not be ignored. Inflation, poverty, resentment, all fed the rise of voices that shouted rather than reasoned, that promised certainty in a time of chaos. Alma, who had lived through the collapse of the empire, who had seen the Gilded Age of Vienna dissolve into hunger and despair, recognized the danger, though she was not always precise in her politics. She sensed in the air the same instability that she felt within herself, the same contradictions that had defined her life: brilliance and decay, passion and destruction, hope and ruin woven together in one fabric. Werfel, ever the writer of conscience, grew more engaged with the currents of his time. His plays and novels reflected not only personal devotion, but social concern, a desire to address the moral questions of a fractured world. Alma supported him, listened to him, critiqued him, yet her own role was more ambivalent. She thrived in the presence of artists and thinkers, but she did not commit herself fully to causes or to movements. To Alma, life was always lived through the lens of personal relation, of admiration, of love and betrayal. Politics touched her, but rarely did it define her. Yet she could not remain untouched by the gathering storm. Her salons, once places of laughter and art, now carried the murmur of fear. Friends argued not only about form and color, but about power, about safety, about survival. Jews, in particular, felt the tightening of danger, and Werfel, himself Jewish, was increasingly aware of the threat. Alma, Catholic by birth, sometimes spoke with the carelessness of one less endangered, yet she also knew that her life was bound to his, and that what threatened him threatened her. Their bond, once measured in letters of love, now became entwined with letters of exile, of departure, of escape. Imagine Alma in a Berlin apartment during the late 1920s, the windows open to the sounds of the street, the cries of vendors, the rumble of trams, the distant shouts of political rallies. Inside, A circle of friends debates fiercely, their voices rising and falling. A writer warns of danger. A painter insists art must remain pure. A politician shakes his head in despair. Alma listens, her eyes half-lidded, her hand wrapped around the stem of a glass. She interjects with wit, with sharpness, but beneath her composure she feels the unease. Outside, boots echo on the cobblestones, a rhythm that drowns even the laughter within. The shadow of fascism lengthened, first as rumor, then as presence. Alma, who had always lived at the center of admiration, found herself caught in a new tension. Her beauty, her charm, her wit, once shields, could not protect against ideologies that sought to categorize, exclude, destroy. She was still greeted in salons, still admired in gatherings, but the tone had shifted, and the conversations carried a weight that made even her laughter seem brittle. Werfel's career continued to flourish in these years, his writings gaining wider attention, his voice respected. Alma stood beside him, sometimes proud, sometimes impatient, but always central. She was his muse, his critic, his companion, and though their bond was not without quarrels, it deepened in the face of a world that grew more hostile. Fidelity for Alma remained ambiguous, yet her commitment to Werfel grew stronger, shaped not only by love, but by necessity. He needed her presence, her strength, her connections, and she, for all her contradictions, did not abandon him. Her daughter Manon, meanwhile, was growing into a young woman of grace and talent, admired for her beauty and her musical gifts. Alma saw in her both a reflection of herself and a continuation of what she had sacrificed. Yet this promise, too, would be shadowed, for Manon's life, though luminous, was destined to be brief. The tragedies that marked Alma's story did not loosen their hold. They returned again and again, as though sorrow had chosen her as its recurring theme. The interwar years thus became for Alma a time of both brilliance and dread. She remained admired, she remained central, but the world around her was shifting beneath her feet. The salons where she had reigned seemed less certain, the admiration tinged with unease, the conversations haunted by what was to come. Alma, who had lived her life amidst geniuses, amidst beauty and betrayal, now faced a world where genius and beauty were powerless against brutality. The image that closes this chapter is of boots striking cobblestones, steady, echoing, relentless. The sound rises from the streets, enters through the windows, lingers in the ears of those who listen. Alma stands by the window, hearing them, her gaze turned outward, her heart uncertain whether to dismiss them as noise or to recognize them as the rhythm of what is to come. The boots echo, and the room falls silent. And from the echo of those boots, the story moves into flight, into departure, into the desperate journeys that Alma and Werfel would undertake as the shadow of war darkened not only Europe, but their very lives. The boots echoed on the cobblestones, steady, relentless, and from that sound of marching feet, the story turns to flight, to the desperate journeys of exile, to Alma and Franz Werfel, leaving behind not only the cities that had shaped them, but the very ground of their lives. The shadow that had crept across Europe in the interwar years now fell fully, and those who bore the wrong names, the wrong beliefs, the wrong origins, were forced to move or to vanish. Alma, whose life had always been defined by presence, her presence in salons, in marriages, in conversations, now learned the fraught presence of borders, checkpoints, trains, and escape routes. The rise of fascism, once distant, now struck directly. Werfel, as a Jewish writer, was in danger. His works were banned, his name blacklisted, his future imperiled. Alma, though Catholic by birth, was bound to him by devotion and by circumstance. She would not abandon him, though she might once have considered whether freedom lay in leaving. Instead, she gathered her strength, her resources, her connections, and stood beside him. Together they became wanderers, moving from one uncertain refuge to another, their days marked not by the applause of audiences or the chatter of salons, but by the fear of discovery, the necessity of endurance. Their escape from France after the German occupation in 1940 carried the urgency of survival. With others who sought safety, they traveled across the Pyrenees into Spain, the mountains unforgiving, the paths treacherous. Alma, already past 60, carried herself with the same determination that had guided her through griefs and scandals alike. She walked when she must, endured fatigue, endured hunger, endured fear. In her diary, she recorded the harshness of those days, the thin air, the aching muscles, the anxiety of whether they would be turned back. And yet she also wrote of beauty, the vastness of the mountains, the silence broken only by the sound of feet upon rock, the strange dignity of exile when it is shared. From Spain they reached Portugal, and from Portugal at last a passage to America. The journey by sea, though safer than the mountains, carried its own uncertainty. Ships could be intercepted, passengers detained. Alma and Werfel traveled not as celebrated figures, but as fugitives, their names known to authorities, their future dependent upon the goodwill of the strangers. The ocean stretched before them, its waves both threatening and liberating. Alma stood on deck, gazing across waters she had once crossed in luxury, now crossing again in desperation. The salt wind carried memories of her voyage with Mahler, with Gropius, with herself at different stages of life. Now, with Werfel beside her, she felt both the weight of past exiles and the necessity of this new one. Arriving in America, they settled first in New York, later in California, joining the circle of émigrés who had fled Europe's darkness. Writers, musicians, filmmakers, many who had once been the pride of Vienna and Berlin, now found themselves gathered under the alien light of Los Angeles. Alma, ever adaptable, entered this new society with her customary grace. She attended gatherings, she conversed with old acquaintances and new companions, she resumed the role of presence, even in exile. Yet beneath the surface lay the dissonance of displacement. The palm trees, the wide streets, the Hollywood studios were a world apart from the narrow alleys of Vienna, the cafes of Berlin, the salons of her youth. She lived, but she did not wholly belong. Werfel, too, struggled with the transformation. His works, though still respected, were now written in exile, their tone marked by longing for the Europe they had lost. Alma supported him as she had supported Mahler and Gropius, offering counsel, critique, encouragement. She became again the anchor for another's creativity, though she herself remained without her own published music. Yet in this role she found purpose, for exile demands strength, and she possessed it. Imagine Alma walking along a Californian street, the air heavy with the scent of eucalyptus, the sun bright upon stucco walls. Around her, voices speak English, a language still foreign to her tongue, a rhythm she cannot master. She pauses before a shop window, her reflection mingling with displays of goods unfamiliar. Behind her, palm fronds sway in the breeze, indifferent to history. In that reflection, she sees not only herself, but the ghosts of Vienna, of Berlin, of the mountains crossed, of the ships endured. She moves on, carrying them all with her. Exile reshaped Alma's identity. Once admired for her beauty, for her presence in Europe's cultural elite, she was now a refugee, her glamour muted by necessity. Yet she did not surrender to despair. She remained proud, elegant, commanding. Friends remarked that she carried Vienna with her wherever she went, that in her presence one could almost believe the old world still existed. Perhaps this was her greatest talent, to embody continuity even amidst rupture, to make exile feel less like loss and more like transformation. Still, she could not escape sorrow. News from Europe brought accounts of devastation, of friends lost, of horrors beyond imagination. Alma recorded her anguish, her disbelief, her recognition that the world she had known was gone forever. Werfel, too, was shaken, and his writings of these years bear the weight of exile and loss. Their bond, though tested by grief and distance, grew deeper. Alma, who had once wavered between men, now remained steadfast. In Werfel, she found not only a lover, but a companion in survival, and in the face of such darkness, she did not abandon him. The image that closes this chapter is of a train departing, heavy wheels grinding against rails, smoke billowing upward. Alma stands on the platform of memory, watching it vanish, knowing that it carries away not only passengers, but the life she once lived in Europe. The sound of its departure lingers, a reminder that exile is not only movement, but also loss, that each step towards safety is also a step away from what can never be regained. And from the fading echo of that departing train, the story turns to the strange light of California, to the palm trees and hills where Alma would once again gather with artists, with émigrés, with those who sought to rebuild life in a world that had been torn apart. The echo of the departing train faded into distance, its smoke dissolving into air, and from that vanishing sound the story moves to a place where trains no longer define journeys, but where palm trees bent in unfamiliar breezes. California awaited, its hills golden in sunlight, its nights scented with orange blossoms, its skies vast and untroubled compared to the narrow vaults of Europe. Into this landscape, Alma and Franz Werfel arrived, joining a community of exiles who had carried across the ocean not only their possessions, but also the weight of memory, of language, of homes left behind. Los Angeles in the 1940s was both strange and seductive. The city sprawled rather than clustered, its avenues lined not with stone facades, but with billboards, its energy devoted less to opera houses than to film studios. Yet for the émigrés who gathered there, it became a kind of transplanted Europe, an improvised salon beneath a Californian sky. Writers, composers, directors, and intellectuals, once central to Vienna and Berlin, now found themselves neighbors in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills, meeting in houses that overlooked the Pacific. Alma, with her innate gift for presence, stepped easily into this world. She hosted gatherings, attended soirees, brought with her the aura of old Vienna. In her company, the exiles felt less estranged, as though the city around them had momentarily been remade in the shape of memory. She was admired even here, her reputation preceding her. To many, she was a living link to Mahler, to Gropius, to Kokoschka, to the Vienna of Klimt and Freud. Guests leaned forward to hear her recollections, her anecdotes of a world that seemed already legendary. Her voice carried authority, not as a scholar or artist in her own right, but as one who had witnessed, who had inhabited, who had shaped, by her very being, the cultural currents of an age. Alma relished this role, though it was tinged with melancholy, for even as she spoke of the past, she knew it could not return. Werfel, too, found recognition in exile. His novel, The Song of Bernadette, written in America, became an international success, bringing him fame and financial security at a time when many émigrés struggled. Alma supported him, encouraged him, accompanied him to gatherings where Hollywood executives shook hands with European intellectuals. She remained his companion and his critic, as she had with Mahler and Gropius before him. Yet this time her devotion was steadier, her commitment less divided. Perhaps exile had stripped away the luxury of divided loyalties, or perhaps age had softened her restlessness. Whatever the reason, Alma and Werfel stood together, their partnership one of survival as much as of love. Imagine her in a Los Angeles living room, the windows open to the scent of night jasmine, the hum of crickets replacing the carriages of Vienna. Around her gather émigrés, Thomas Mann, Arnold Schoenberg, Lion Feuchtwanger, each carrying his own burden of exile. Voices mingle in German, the cadences of their homeland echoing strangely against the backdrop of California. Alma sits at the center, her eyes luminous, her presence magnetic. She recounts a story of Mahler, a memory of Klimt, a remark of Kokoschka. The room listens, transported for a moment across the ocean, across time, into a world that had vanished, but that still lived in her words. Yet beneath the elegance of these evenings lay the dissonance of displacement. Alma often wrote of her longing for Vienna, for the narrow streets and the familiar rhythms of her youth. The palm trees, though beautiful, seemed alien. The expanses of California left her uneasy. She adapted, but she did not belong. Exile is never only about geography, it is also about identity, and Alma's identity had always been bound to place, to presence, to the recognition of those who understood her. In America, she was admired, but she was also foreign, her grandeur tinged with strangeness. Werfel's health, meanwhile, began to falter. The years of strain, the hardships of exile, the intensity of his work weakened him. Alma once again found herself in the role she had played before: caretaker, nurse, companion to a man whose genius was shadowed by illness. She bore it with a mixture of devotion and weariness, her patience tested, yet her loyalty enduring. Perhaps by now she had accepted that this was her fate, to outlive, to witness, to carry the memory of men whose names would echo through history. Her daughter Manon, living in Europe, became a source of both pride and sorrow. Alma's love for her was fierce, yet distance and circumstance strained their bond. Letters crossed the ocean, carrying news, carrying affection, carrying the ache of separation. Alma, who had already lost one daughter, clung to these connections, fearing yet again the cruelty of fate. The specter of loss never left her. It hovered even in the Californian light, a shadow beneath the brightness. The image that closes this chapter is of palm trees swaying beneath a sky streaked with sunset, their fronds bending in the warm wind. Alma stands upon a terrace gazing outward at the Pacific, the horizon vast and indifferent. Behind her, voices rise in conversation. Laughter breaks out. Glasses clink. She listens, but she does not turn. Her eyes remain fixed on the sea, as though searching for Europe across the waters, as though believing she might still see the faint outline of Vienna shimmering in the distance. And from the sight of those palm trees bending in the evening wind, the story moves inward again, into shadow and quiet, as Werfel's health declines and Alma once more becomes widow, bearing the repetition of loss that seemed written into the pattern of her life. The palm trees swayed in the evening wind, their fronds rustling softly against the vast sky, and from their gentle movement the story turns inward again, into the dim rooms where lamps burned low and silence pressed heavily upon Alma's days. Franz Werfel, whose devotion had been her solace through exile, whose words had carried both love and purpose, began to falter. His health, already fragile from years of strain, weakened steadily in the brightness of California. The warmth of the sun could not cure what age and hardship had written into his body, and once again Alma found herself in the familiar role she had never sought, yet had lived so often: caretaker to a dying man. She had been here before, by the side of Mahler as illness tightened its grip, by the side of others whose brilliance dimmed while she remained. The repetition must have weighed heavily, for to witness decline once is sorrow, but to witness it again and again becomes a pattern, a cruel echo that suggests fate has chosen one to be the custodian of endings. Alma, who had been so often the center of admiration, so often the inspiration of creation, was also the witness to decay, the one who remained when the music ceased, when the brush was laid aside, when the words could no longer be written. Werfel's illness confined him, made him dependent, and Alma's days bent around his needs. She prepared his meals, managed his medicines, read to him, listened to his fears. Her diaries of these years reveal both tenderness and fatigue. She loved him, she reassured him, yet she also felt the weariness of once again giving herself entirely to another's decline. She had hoped, perhaps, that with Werfel the pattern might be different, that she might not once more be left behind. But the rhythm repeated, inexorable, and Alma endured it with a mixture of devotion and bitterness. The gatherings in Los Angeles continued, though less frequently. Friends visited, émigrés came to pay respect. But the tone had changed. The laughter was muted, the conversations quieter. Werfel, though weakened, still listened, still offered his thoughts when strength allowed. Alma guided these evenings, ensuring he was not overtaxed, maintaining the semblance of life as it had been. Yet beneath the careful arrangements lay the knowledge that time was slipping away. Imagine Alma sitting at Werfel's bedside, the curtains drawn against the glaring sun, the air heavy with the scent of flowers brought by friends. Werfel's voice is faint, his breath shallow, yet his eyes still turn toward her with affection. He reaches for her hand and she gives it, holding it firmly though her mind drifts elsewhere, perhaps to Mahler, perhaps to Gropius, perhaps to the countless moments when she had sat in this same posture with another man. The weight of memory presses upon her as much as the weight of the present. She whispers words of comfort, though she knows they cannot halt what approaches. When Werfel died in 1945, Alma was once again cast into widowhood. She was 66 years old, marked by years of brilliance and sorrow, admired and resented in equal measure. With Werfel's passing, she became not only his widow, but the custodian of his legacy, as she had done with Mahler. She arranged his affairs, preserved his works, spoke of him with reverence. Yet she must also have felt the repetition with a sharpness that cut deeper than grief alone. To lose once is tragedy. To lose thrice becomes identity. Alma was not only muse, not only lover, she was widow, perpetually left behind, perpetually tasked with remembering. Her later years in America were quieter but no less complex. She remained a presence in émigré circles, still admired, still central, though now more as figure of history than as participant in new creation. She published memoirs shaping her own story, presenting herself as indispensable to the men whose names had become legend. In these writings, she defended herself against accusations, justified her choices, emphasized her importance. Some praised her honesty, others criticized her vanity. But Alma had never been concerned with pleasing everyone. She had always been concerned with shaping memory, and in this she succeeded. Her relationship with her daughter Manon had already ended in tragedy years earlier, when the young woman died at the age of 18. That loss had scarred Alma deeply, another repetition of the cruel fate that had taken her first daughter Pootsie. With Werfel gone, with Manon gone, Alma's later life became increasingly a life of memory, of solitude filled with recollection. Friends visited, admirers sought her out, but the house grew quieter, the rooms filled less with laughter than with the rustle of pages, the scratch of her pen, the echo of voices long silent. The pattern of her life, admiration, passion, betrayal, widowhood, seemed complete. Yet even in age she retained her presence, her sharp wit, her striking gaze. Those who met her in her final decades spoke of a woman still commanding, still certain of her role in history, still unwilling to be dismissed. She embodied an era that had vanished, carried it within her like a relic, offering it to those who came to listen. The image that closes this chapter is of a lamp being extinguished slowly, the flame dimming, flickering, and at last fading into darkness. Alma sits in the quiet room after Werfel's passing, the air heavy with silence, the house vast around her. She is alone once more, the repetition complete, the cycle of devotion and widowhood fulfilled yet again. The lamp has gone out, but the night remains, waiting for the next page to be written. And from the darkness of that extinguished lamp, the story moves to the years that followed, when Alma, now alone, turned to her own writing, her memoirs, shaping the narrative of her life, shaping not only how she would be remembered, but how the men she had loved would be seen through her eyes. The lamp was extinguished, its flame flickering once before surrendering, and from that darkness the story moves into the dim rooms of Alma's later years, where silence pressed heavily and memory became her only constant companion. With Werfel gone, with her daughters taken by illness long before, Alma faced the long stretch of widowhood once more. Yet she did not sink into obscurity. Instead, she turned to the one task still within her power, the shaping of her own story. Through memoirs, letters, and conversations, Alma sought to define her life, to defend her choices, to ensure that history would remember her not as a footnote to men's lives, but as a presence essential to their creation. Her house in New York, later in Vienna once she returned, became less a salon than an archive. Papers, letters, manuscripts, photographs filled her rooms, evidence of the lives she had shared. Alma began to write with urgency, as though she understood that memory, if not captured, would slip into silence. Her memoirs recounted her childhood, her marriages, her loves, her losses. They were filled with anecdotes of Gustav Mahler's genius, of Gropius's vision, of Kokoschka's obsession, of Werfel's devotion. In telling their stories, she told her own. Yet the line between truth and self-fashioning blurred, for Alma was less concerned with accuracy than with legacy. She defended herself against accusations, softened her betrayals, heightened her importance. Was this vanity, or was it survival? Perhaps both, for Alma had always lived in the eyes of others, and in her final years, she sought to fix those eyes upon her as she wished to be seen. Her writings portray her as indispensable to Mahler, as the one who shaped his final works, who guided his genius. They present her as loyal to Gropius, as Muse to Kokoschka, as the source of Werfel's inspiration. Critics accused her of exaggeration, of distorting facts, of rewriting history to serve her own image. But Alma knew that history is rarely pure, that memory is always interpretation. By writing her story, she ensured that no one else could entirely claim it. She gave herself the final word, even if that word was contested. Visitors who came to see her in these years often described her as formidable. Age had touched her beauty, but her presence remained commanding. She spoke with wit, with authority, with the confidence of one who had stood at the center of history. Younger admirers leaned close to hear her tales. Scholars sought her recollections. Friends and enemies alike acknowledged that she carried within her the spirit of an age that had passed. She was, in herself, a living relic, yet she refused to be only relic. She spoke as though the salons still sparkled, as though Mahler had only just left the room, as though Kokoschka still painted feverishly, as though Werfel might return at any moment. Imagine her seated at a desk in her later years, the lamp now lit once more, casting its glow over stacks of papers. She bends over a page, her pen scratching slowly, her hand unsteady, yet determined. The room is quiet, the sounds of the city muted beyond heavy curtains. On the desk lies a photograph of Mahler, another of Werfel, another of Manon. Alma pauses, gazes at them, then returns to her writing. Her sentences shift between confession and defense, between tenderness and pride. She writes not only for herself, but for the world she imagines will still care. Her memoirs stirred controversy, as she surely expected. Some praised them as invaluable accounts of cultural history, first-hand witness to the giants of her time. Others dismissed them as self-serving, as distortions meant to elevate her at the expense of truth. Alma was not blind to these judgments, but neither was she deterred. She had been judged all her life, admired and despised in equal measure, and she had long ago accepted that contradiction as her fate. What mattered was that she remained central, that her name endured, that she would not vanish into silence. The act of writing gave her a sense of control she had often lacked. In her marriages, she had surrendered her music, her independence, her fidelity. In her widowhood, she had surrendered to grief. But in her memoirs, she surrendered nothing. She claimed authority. She claimed memory. She claimed her own narrative. Whether true or not, whether accurate or embellished, it was hers. Perhaps this was her final act of creation, not in music, not in art, but in the shaping of self through words. Her later years were marked by solitude, but not isolation. Friends still visited, admirers still sought her company, though the gatherings were smaller, quieter. The great salons of Vienna were gone forever. The émigré evenings of Los Angeles faded into memory. What remained were conversations in small rooms, letters exchanged with those who still remembered. Alma, though often alone, was never forgotten. She ensured it by the force of her presence, by the persistence of her voice. Yet even as she wrote, even as she defended, the questions lingered. Was she truly indispensable to Mahler, or did she merely wish to be? Was she muse or manipulator? Inspiration or distraction, partner or rival? Alma herself never resolved these questions, and perhaps she did not wish to. Ambiguity had always been her power, the space between truth and fiction where she could shape herself as needed. To define her too clearly would be to diminish her. She lived in contradiction, and she wrote in contradiction, and it is in contradiction that her legacy endures. The image that closes this chapter is of pages rustling in the quiet of night, the sound of paper turned by a hand, unsteady with age. The lamp glows softly, illuminating words that will outlive the hand that wrote them. Alma leans back, her eyes weary but satisfied, knowing that she has once again placed herself at the center of the narrative. The rustle of pages lingers, unresolved, as though history itself were still being written. And from the sound of those rustling pages, the story moves into its final chapter, into the solitude of Alma's last years, when memory became her only companion and the question of who she truly was remained unanswered, resting in the silence of an empty salon. The rustle of pages lingered in the dimly lit room, each sheet turned with care, each word a thread woven into the tapestry of memory, and from that faint sound the story enters its final chamber. The pages once set down, the pen once laid aside, Alma was left with silence once more, though it was no longer the silence of expectation, but of completion. Her life, stretched across the span of nearly 9 decades, had carried her through the heights of Vienna's golden age, through the storms of passion, through the devastations of war and exile, and into the quiet of old age. Now, as the years dwindled, she inhabited a space where memory was both companion and weight, where all the voices that had once surrounded her had faded into absence. In her last years, Alma lived in Vienna again, the city of her youth, though it was no longer the same. The empire was gone, the salons dispersed, the names that had once filled concert halls and cafes now belonged to history books. Yet she carried the essence of that vanished world within her, and those who came to see her came as much to glimpse that world as to see the woman herself. Visitors described her as formidable, even in her 80s, her eyes still sharp, her voice still resonant, her presence still commanding. Age had bent her body, but not her spirit. She remained Alma, defined not only by what she had lived, but by how she insisted it be remembered. Her solitude was heavy, but not barren. She had company in her papers, in her memories, in the relics of her past, Portraits by Kokoschka, scores by Mahler, letters from Gropius, books by Werfel. Each object was more than a possession. It was a presence, a fragment of the lives she had entwined with her own. She spoke of them often, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with sharpness, sometimes with the pride of one who had stood at the center of their creation. Yet in the quiet of night, when the visitors had gone and the lamp flickered low, she must have felt the weight of absence. For to be custodian of memory is to live always with ghosts. Imagine her seated in her chair in the late afternoon, the curtains drawn slightly to soften the harsh light. The room smells faintly of old books, of fading flowers. On the table beside her rests a photograph of Mahler, his stern face gazing outward, alongside another of Werfel, his expression softer, more human. Alma studies them both, her hands resting in her lap. She sighs, not with regret, but with the fatigue of long remembrance. Outside, the city hums with modern life, unrecognizable to her eyes, yet she remains fixed in the world that had already passed. Her later conversations often circled back to the same themes: her role as Muse, her sacrifices, her grievances, her triumphs. She defended herself against accusations of vanity, of betrayal, of manipulation. She insisted upon her importance, upon the necessity of her presence in the lives of the men she had loved. Some believed her, others doubted, but all acknowledged that her voice could not be ignored. Alma had lived not only as participant in history, but as its narrator, and in narrating she ensured her survival. Yet beneath her insistence lay the unanswerable question: who was Alma truly, beyond the reflections cast upon her by others? Was she a creator silenced, a muse exalted, a manipulator cunning, or simply a woman seeking recognition in a world that denied her equality? The truth, as always with Alma, is not singular. She was all of these and none of these, shifting with circumstance, shaping herself as carefully as she shaped her memoirs. Her legacy remains ambiguous, unsettled, unresolved, perhaps deliberately so. As age deepened, her body weakened. She moved less, spoke less, yet her presence still carried authority. Those who came to see her near the end found her seated quietly, her gaze distant as though she already conversed with the shadows of those long gone. When she died in 1964 at the age of 85, Vienna mourned her not as a widow, nor as a muse, but as a figure of its history, the last great witness of its golden age. Her funeral drew admirers, critics, and the merely curious, all aware that, with Alma Mahler, a chapter of Europe's cultural story had closed. The final image is of an empty salon. The chairs are arranged as though awaiting guests. The air still carries the faint echo of music. The dust settles slowly in golden shafts of light. No voices rise, no laughter breaks, no quarrels ignite. Only silence remains, the silence of a room once filled with brilliance and scandal, now left to memory alone. In that silence, Alma lingers, not as a figure defined, but as a question, an enigma, a presence unresolved. And so the story ends not with certainty, but with ambiguity, as all true stories of lives must. Alma Mahler remains muse, manipulator, lover, widow, creator, destroyer, each title true, each incomplete. She remains above all human, marked by beauty, ambition, and contradiction. The empty salon holds her still, its silence filled with all she was and all she refused to be.